Hi. Welcome to Artist and Critic. I'm Don Gray. With us this evening is an extremely interesting guest. She's Bonnie Burnham, author of a recently published book, The Art Crisis, published by St. Martin's Press, and it is subtitled, How Art Has Become the Victim of Thieves, Smugglers, and Respectable Investors. And I guess that's what the art crisis is about. Bonnie, may I call you Bonnie?
Yes, you may.
You divide the book into three sections, stolen art, the antiquities crisis, and the art boom. Maybe we can just start with stolen art. You write it in a very lively, interesting fashion with a number of anecdotes and examples, and I'm thinking particularly of a man by the name of Sergei Magron, if I'm not mispronouncing that. Am I?
Well, Serge.
Serge.
In French, although he's of Russian descent. So.
All right. Well, then I butchered. How did I do with Magron? Did I survive on that? Mm-hmm. Okay. I wonder, could you tell about his adventures with some stolen Impressionist paintings and ultimately why he was defeated?
Yes, actually, he's one of the more fascinating people in the art theft and recovery world, simply because of first of all, the work that he did, the tremendous success that he had, recovering a number of very important stolen works that disappeared in France, and the fact that this is a very typical example of the kind of thing that has happened in this field a number of times over and over to different people. But he began as an antique dealer. He got interested in the idea of recovering art through some other sort of detective work that he began doing quite on the side, recovering jewelry and so on. And he was commissioned on a number of occasions to do an investigation on very important works that disappeared from a couple of galleries in Paris. And the one that I write about is 11 paintings that disappeared from Paris gallery. Most of them Impressionist works and Picasso's and so on. Mm-hmm. And essentially, he managed to make a connection with a sort of major mafioso in Paris who was very heavily connected in the drug world, and came across these paintings, which the Paris police thought was a very important breakthrough to link this to organized crime. Through a series of manipulations and hair-raising experiences, he managed to get them back, and so on. All this is recounted in the book, essentially by him to me. But what I found to be the most interesting thing about him was that he hoped to set up a kind of a bureau which would be capable of recovering works of art from everywhere, essentially, all around Europe, even things that ended up in the United States and so on. Which no one was paying him for specifically. And this was the central idea of his wanting to do this. There's no one to pay financially for the very expensive maneuver of recovering stolen art. Unfortunately, he ran into administrative problems. He couldn't, although he could operate all right in France because he had the cooperation of the local police and so on, he was not known in the other countries, and he got into a series of scrapes and ended up in jail a couple of times, and eventually was defeated by sort of officialdom.
Well, doesn't it, the reason I asked you about this, yes, is that it seems that we'll get into the reasons why art thefts have been multiplying tremendously. Just the huge theft of Picasso works from a museum in Avignon, I believe, just a couple of weeks ago. It's obviously because of the money involved, of course, isn't it? The prices and so forth. But it seems that there are no official organizations that will take any action. Is there really? I mean, there's just no way to turn, really.
That's right, essentially. The action that is taken is very limited. It really very much depends on, essentially, on whether an object is insured. Whether someone is going to take an active interest in getting it back, or if it's a very, very important work from a national museum. Otherwise, an art owner may find that he has very little recourse when something is stolen and very little hope of getting it back. And this is made doubly impossible by the fact that most art owners don't have any kind of adequate documentation of the objects that they have, either in terms of photographs or in terms of even bills of sale or title of ownership. And frequently, large caches of works of art are recovered by the police, which one assumes to be stolen. They were recovered from fences and so on. And the police have no way of finding out who the owner is. And often the owner has no, even if he's found, has no way of establishing that it's really his. And so the works of art will revert back to the fence, essentially. And people have walked out of courtrooms with paintings that are known to belong to someone else.
Someone else, but they don't know who, and they can't find out.
Well, that's right.
Whom. You mentioned, too, in your book about the International Art Registry as being one means of registering art, but the museums have a strange reaction to that. What's the problem?
Well, I think the problem, again, is expense. The International Art Registry, in particular, is quite expensive. And it has proved to be, I think, a very useful alternative for private owners. Most museums, it's based on a kind of a fingerprinting system where the art registry takes a picture of a painting, then applies a grid to it and registers various characteristics when the painting crosses the grid, and puts all this on computer. It's rather sophisticated. Obviously, they have to make photographs, and most museums feel that their own photographs are adequate for the purpose of loss or damage that might occur during transit or something like that. And I suppose this is generally true. One problem with museums, though, is that there is no standard system of cataloging works of art. And there have been many efforts, and I am involved in one right now, which we hope will really get off the ground, to develop a means of cataloging stolen art. But in this area, museums seem to be of no help at all. First of all, from the standpoint of background, and even from the standpoint of accepting and supporting an idea like this, they're very much very reluctant.
I got the feeling from reading your book that there was a certain amount of snobbery involved, that the museum saw themselves as rather beyond the uses of essentially a commercial organization, which I guess the art registry is, and they felt themselves almost too good for that. Did I misread your statement about that? Or?
Well, you certainly, I may have generalized a bit if I did say this. You can't,
okay, I'm not going to go side chapter and verse. That was the impression I was left with.
In any case, you can't really draw a standard picture. But if I've been critical of museums, it's mostly because I feel that this is one area where leadership should come from, and where it has not necessarily been forthcoming. I think museums are going to have to really face the idea that art theft is a potential problem. Many of them are now, more and more, even as 6 months has passed since I began working on this new program. There's been much wider acceptance for the idea.
Speaking of museums and culpability, you discuss them fairly thoroughly and in not too flattering terms, if I may say so, in terms of the fact that not only are they participating in, buying smuggled goods in the second section of your book, dealing with the antiquities crisis, which we can discuss, but also through the fact that museums are so overcrowded and so concerned with attendance figures and so concerned with growth for its own sake, that art itself is becoming debased and devalued spiritually through their misapplication of their own function, if that's a good way to put it. How do you feel about that?
I do believe that. And I think that many museums are rather helpless and recognize this as a conflict, but don't know quite how to deal with it. This whole question of what seems to be self-aggrandizement and to some degree ignoring the public, the very public that the museum is trying to court in terms of numbers and in terms of convincing money groups that they should receive more money and larger grants and
because
more public
of the increased
funds.
attendance. And
Right, because of increased attendance. It is a difficult problem to cope with. The crowds are made up of individuals. And as art becomes more and more expensive to transport, exhibitions become more expensive to put on, and certain kinds of objects become almost too expensive to exhibit. when you're talking about paintings like the Mona Lisa, which are so notorious that every time they move, some kind of international incident is bound to ensue. I think that this is a little outside of the bounds of importance and of reality in terms of dealing with art, and anyone being able to enjoy the art is a real personal experience.
Isn't what you're talking about in your book essentially the fact that money has come to dominate not only in the art world but in society at large, and we've lost sight of perhaps more profound values? I mean, we've lost, if we just leave it strictly to art for the moment, hasn't the money blinded us to the spiritual and profound human values that the art has? Hence, everything has just gone crazy, really.
Well, it seems that most of the ills that I talk about in my book are directly attributable to money in the art world and in large quantities. This is certainly an unavoidable byproduct of the fact that many more people are interested in art. But there have been all kinds of events that have had as their purpose to inflate the value of art and to keep pumping more money and more price increases into the art market. And I think that this has been bad for almost everyone concerned. Perhaps it's been good in the short run for artists, but I think that this is perhaps the only group that has been able to benefit in any direct way. And even then, the artist-dealer relationship becomes more and more artificial every year.
Yeah, I almost see this vast amount of money, and frankly, I don't think it's spread through the vast level of artists. I think maybe there are just a few at the top who receive extraordinary amounts of money, and I think it's almost corrupting in the sense that they almost lose sight of their own artistic identity and what they wanted to create in the first place, and say, my God, I'm worth all this money, everything I touch. You know? I mean, it's so much laying on the line that there's a tendency to just hollowly echo what they've created before. It just seems terribly destructive in that sense.
Well, I can certainly attest that it's just destructive in other areas. Actually, one thing that I do deal with, if only briefly, the only point where I do touch the contemporary art market is the idea of the art investment company actually commissioning works of art in series in order to sell them at a profit, in order to pay dividends to investors and so on. And this seems to me a clear example of a corrupt system in commissioning something which has to have a specific designation as a Liechtenstein that looks like a Liechtenstein, so that in 5 years it will be worth 30% more than it is now.
Exactly.
And this is corroborating what you were saying, I suppose.
Terribly artificial. We are, of course, talking to Bonnie Burnham, author of The Art Crisis, and the third section of her book, dealing with the art boom, discusses the problems that we've been talking about. Could you talk about how these art finance, that's not quite the art investment companies like Artemis and Modarco, how they came into existence and some of the differing philosophy of the two companies, perhaps? Well,
how they came into existence is a bit of a mystery to me, but they came into existence about the same time, which is around 1970. I suppose there was a lot of talk in the wind at that time that such huge profits were being turned over at auction, and people disposing of paintings they had bought in the late 50s were making such enormous increases that it obviously dawned that this could be done as a business. The two that I use as examples in the book, Artemis and Modarco, are very different. Modarco is essentially in the public domain. An individual can buy shares in the company. There's a certain capital base which expands according to the number of people who invest in it and so on. And shares sell for about $100, as I recall. They pay a yearly dividend of about 5%, which the last I heard was increasing every year. And the company then owns a stock of paintings. And these seem to be divided primarily into two groups, so-called masterpieces and speculative works done by contemporary artists. The masterpieces
quote unquote
are primarily, in Modarco's case, Picasso's and Matisse's and Impressionist work, early 20th century paintings of high quality. And these are bought under the best conditions that can be obtained and kept a certain amount of time and sold in order to pay the dividend. Then the money is reinvested in other works, of course, and the part that's not paid. And this is primarily the young artist's work, either individual paintings or series of graphics and things of this kind, which can be then sold to corporations and money turned over, or in backing dealers to put on an exhibition of a certain artist, and things of this kind.
What's objectionable in the art investment companies? What do you feel is anti-art, if we could put it that way?
Well, I think that the manipulation for a profit is anti-art and is artificial. For example, Modarco, the director of Modarco, gave me an example of an auction that he had attended in order to buy a Picasso. He didn't buy the Picasso, but he was the underbidder and managed to bring the price of Picasso up so high because he was bidding against a private collector whom he knew probably beforehand he could not possibly gain the upper hand over. Would they have gotten
together and agreed on what they
No,
how
but
high
I
they
think
might go?
he understood that this collector was going to be bidding on the painting. He went far above the price that he had intended to pay, knowing that the other person would probably outbid him. And this, he said, he did because it raised the price on a couple of other paintings of the same period that he had, by Picasso and Braque. So now that this Picasso had gone for, I think, something like £360,000, he felt that his Braque was worth £500,000, and he was prepared to sell it. He had only bought the Braque about a year before for $125,000. So this could be considered a fairly neat profit.
Yeah, I would say so.
On the other hand, I don't think that it has too much to do with the reality of what the Braque may actually be worth. And the very fact that these paintings are available to no one, they're kept in a warehouse and so on, seems to be very anti-art.
I was interested, Ephraim Illen, is that pronounced correctly?
Right.
Is the president, if that's a proper term, for Modarco. And as you remark in your book, he is a businessman all the way, into going so far as to figure that the average artist will complete 3,000 paintings in his lifetime, and then thinking, well, let's see, there are so many museums in the world, and if each gets 3 or 4 paintings, there aren't enough paintings to go around. Lo and behold, there's an art crisis, to borrow your word, a shortage of art, and Ellen is in the position to fulfill this need that he is.
Well, I think he sees himself, and I'm sure it can be argued this way, as a patron of the arts, and someone who is pumping money into the art market in order to produce more works of art. And I think this is certainly a legitimate idea. In fact, the only kind of art investment that I could say I do condone would be individuals investing in works by contemporary artists. But I think there's a fine line of difference between doing this as a business and doing it for the personal fulfillment. Even though Illen is himself a collector, I think what he does with Modarco is something completely separate.
I think what we're talking about too, to me it's the most complete fallacy that money guarantees the production of art. You know, it seems to me, Judge, just looking around the art world as a whole, and I must admit my view is terribly jaundiced because I don't think there's much of any value being produced or has been produced in the last 15 years if we want to set an arbitrary time period. And all the money that has been pumped in there, I can't see a connection between the money and the quality of the art produced. Yeah, there may be a lot of a quantity of art, but it seems the quality is just terribly limited and depends upon people willing to work rather than the money that is given to them. I mean, is that agreeable to you, or did I?
Well, I'm certainly not a critic, and I don't particularly agree with you about the quality of work in the last 15 years. But in any case, I think that it's irrelevant. In other words, the amount of money being paid for art, I don't think has anything to do specifically with the quality of work being produced. And it could even be that the greatest artists of our time, or what will be considered to be the greatest artists of our time, are not making any money.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, that's sort of what I'm saying in a sense, that there's kind of a confusion of money with
I don't think it's
aesthetics.
altogether bad that there is money available for art. It certainly allows many more people to function as artists and teachers and so on. But on the other hand, I don't really think that it has anything to do with encouraging the creation of extremely good works of art.
Do you, your whole theme in your book, The Art Crisis, we're talking to Bonnie Burnham, the author of it, it seems that greed is the dominating emotion there, and which I guess is understandable when we're talking about all the money that's involved here. Does that concern for money in art just reflect society at large? I mean, have we become just so materialistic, and have we lost sight of spiritual or artistic values in a sense?
Well, I think so. In fact, although again, I have to qualify my position. I'm not a philosopher.
Oh,
but,
we're all philosophers.
one thing, the reason that I call the book The Art Crisis is that it does seem to resemble other situations which have happened in other sectors of contemporary civilized life, like the environment, for example, where something that has never been considered a commodity suddenly becomes a commodity, and this connotation is corruptive, and where just to maintain the simple, what would have been its definition value, the value of the environment is X, suddenly becomes something that has to be defended through legislation and lobbying and movements. I feel this is similar to what has happened in the art world. That art is a necessary function of civilized life, and that everyone should be able to experience in some way, have a personal experience with works of art. I mean, I'm referring specifically to Western, what we conceive of in the West as works of art, paintings and sculptures and so on. I feel that these kinds of objects do not function as works of art for an individual on a personal level inside a museum. In a museum, there are documents, there are historical evidence of a sort.
Rather in personal settings, and you mentioned in your book the episode of the young student, I think in 1953, stealing a Rodin, almost borrowing a Rodin sculpture from the Victoria and Albert Museum, taking it home for 2 weeks to live with it, and then returning it.
Well, so, this is certainly an example.
Of just what you're saying.
Yes, and I feel that at the moment when it becomes impossible for an individual to experience art in an individual way, that this becomes a moment of crisis.
So we have 1 minute left. We're living in an impersonal, mechanical age, as you describe it in the book, and I happen to totally agree with you. Mm-hmm. Where are we going from here? What's going to happen? Is there any hope at all, or are we just going to flush ourselves down some gigantic sewer with our dollar bill swirling?
Well, I hope not. I think that things can change and are changing. I think that art is going to get too expensive even for the big museums at some point. The money is not going to be justifiable. The deficits in running expenses are going to become so large that something is going to have to be done in terms of reorganization. I hope to see a period where more attention in institutions will be paid to enriching the public through deeper experiences with the museum's own objects than in putting on extravaganzas, which has been the tendency in the last 10 or 15 years. And I think that art theft is something that will take a downturn when the authorities learn how to deal with it, which it's such a new phenomenon today that everyone is a bit perplexed, really. So I think there is some hope, there's small hope in every area, which altogether probably constitutes a lot. I can't say that the situation is going to turn around. I don't think it will. Yeah. No, but the recession has certainly not been bad for this in many ways, I think.
Because it dampens the fervor and holds it down.
Well, that's right. Certainly, people who are in the art world, in order to make a large profit in a short amount of time, are not going to buy something when money is tight.
Thanks very much. We've been speaking with Bonnie Burnham, author of The Art Crisis, a very interesting book with a lot of anecdotes and episodes of theft, skullduggery, and well, problems, but it's really very interesting reading, put out by St. Martin's Press. I recommend it highly. You've been listening to Artist and Critic. You've been watching it too. I'm Don Gray. Good night.